Hey guys, welcome back to Project Bodybuilding. The dust from the Mr. Olympia this year and the entire season has settled for the most part. Right now we are in the slow time of the year for bodybuilding, but as we ticked past this weekend, we are now inside of 9 weeks out of the 2025 Arnold Classic. The Arnold is pretty much the start of the competitive season for the year, so in 9 weeks we will be starting another great season of bodybuilding. In the meantime, this time of year got me thinking about all sorts of lineups and matchups between former Arnold Classic competitors. And of course, I thought about Hadi Choopan because he lives rent-free in my head, and obviously he was this year's Arnold Classic champion. But it's not just that. That package that he brought to the event was jaw-dropping. I'm on record saying this was probably a top 15 physique of all time. But today, I'm putting him in a matchup with a very dangerous challenger. This competitor gets a lot of flack, and the word overrated gets thrown at him a lot, but a 2019 Arnold Classic Brandon Curry is a very threatening package for most guys. Brandon was at his all-time best then, even better than the 2019 Olympia, honestly. Maybe he's not getting the respect now, but I think history will be fairly kind to Brandon as we progress. Like I said, he can go toe-to-toe with a surprising amount of competitors. But does this include another future Hall of Famer, Hadi Choopan? Let's jump into today's video to find out. Here's 2019 Arnold Classic Brandon Curry versus 2024 Arnold Classic Hadi Choopan. If you guys like these types of videos, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more. These guys both start out very strong in the front double biceps. Now, the main reason these guys are called the best version of each gentleman respectively is because they have their normal strong points intact, but their weaknesses are really dialed back. Brandon's legs are really not that bad from the front. Now, they're still weak, and they are weaker in different shots, but this is far and away the best Brandon's legs have ever looked. That same 3D fullness that he always has in the upper body finally trickled its way down somewhat to the lower body, and he has some decent separation too. But of course, Hadi is still definitely winning here on size and separation and detail. Speaking of Hadi, his longtime critique was that he's blocky, but here at the Arnold, I was shocked when I first saw how exaggerated his V taper was and how much he brought the waist in. The vacuum in the shot is just crazy as well. He's winning the midsection against Brandon Curry of all people. However, I would give Brandon the slight win in the overall V taper because he has the better lats and a very tight waist as well. His proportions are just crazy. Brandon does round out this pose with another win in the arms. Brandon does round this pose out with another win in the arms. His guns are actually some of the best of all time, especially for the front double biceps pose. Although this was another area that was majorly improved for Hadi at the Arnold, so he still holds up way better than expected. I think overall both guys are cutting tremendous outlines, and that's the important thing. So this is close. Close enough that there really isn't a wrong answer. Brandon, I would say, has the stronger upper body by a hair with better arms, but at the same time, like most of his opponents, Hadi has the better overall balance, conditioning, and for him specifically, he has that crazy vacuum. I'm personally a big fan of Hadi in the shot, so I'm going with him. Now, in my judging, I like to use a margin of victory system because I think margin of victory is important. If a competitor wins a pose barely, it's a 1-point win, all the way up to a dominant win being worth 3 points. Because they're both so good, it can really go to either of them. In my mind, this would be a 1-pointer to either guy depending on your decision, again because it's so close, but for me, Hadi is getting my point. Going to the next front shot, I want to add a disclaimer that Brandon's photos are taken from a lower angle. That's really going to help in a pose like this, and maybe explain some of my poor sizing. I know there's always an excuse. But at the same time, the things that do make Brandon look great in the shot can't really be chalked up to just camera angles. This is because Brandon isn't necessarily winning on the key factor here, width. The camera may make him look a little bit wider, but still, Hadi is clearly a bit wider in the shoulders and in the lats themselves. Now, Brandon is very wide, don't get me wrong, but that's not where he's beating Hadi. What makes Brandon so good is the depth, thickness, and overall 3D qualities to his physique. Hadi looks frail by comparison. His chest has no depth, the arms, especially the forearms, need to be thicker, and the delts are sus. Brandon is bursting full in all these areas and brings a ton of striations to the chest. Even his lats just look more substantial than Hadi's, and Brandon's taper lower as well. So overall, I not only prefer Brandon and the lats when you include all aspects, like thickness, but he's blowing Hadi out of the water in all the extra bits. Sure, Hadi's winning the legs, but if Brandon's are solid, which they at least are here, he can really let his upper body shine. And his upper body could have made him a multi-time Mr. Olympia champion if only he didn't falter in the legs so much over the years. But here, he's not, and the upper body is also at its all-time best, so I see this as an even more conclusive pose as the last one, which means Brandon will be receiving 2 points in the front lat spread. Now we have our first side pose, the side chest. This pose just suits Brandon perfectly. For one, his main weakness, the legs, don't actually look weak here. I wouldn't say he beats Hadi's side leg because Hadi is more deeply separated, but Brandon is bigger, so there's technically an argument for him. The main point is that he's definitely not weak. And this is where Hadi stops winning. You may want to put the midsection in his column, I suppose, but Brandon is very solid here as well. After that, Brandon cleans up in those important upper body areas. With his 3D fullness, he looks so impressive in the arms, delts, and the chest. Hadi also never had the strongest chest. It's always been fairly flat, and he's kind of losing the delts and arms outright anyway because there's some weirdness going on in the close arm and delt tie-in area. And the far one looks pointy as well. Hadi is a bit wider, shoulder to shoulder, and yeah, he brings a conditioned pose, but Brandon's physique is just so vibrant. He's so 3D and has good enough details where it counts on top of being more muscular looking overall. I think it's enough for Brandon to just barely break into that 2-point margin yet again. And now we have the first hot take of this comparison. We're here in the first back pose now, the rear double. And I have to say, Brandon's back is kind of overrated. I think it was pretty good for a couple of years, almost exclusively just 2019 though, but 2020 was pretty good as well. But that means what you're looking at now is Brandon's best back ever. And I gotta be honest, I don't think this makes the list of top 10 backs of all time. And that's just talking about the back. I would bet for the rear double poses specifically, Brandon would be hard pressed to make the top 15. And then when you add the lower body into consideration, it drags the entire pose down as a whole. His hamstrings are okay, but the glutes are underdeveloped and the quad sweeps are very weak. And remember, this is where they were the strongest. So I stand by my claim that Brandon is kind of overrated here. Luckily, he's just going up against Hadi today. But I have to be honest, I kind of think this is close. For one, Hadi wins the lower body. I don't think that really needs an explanation. But in the back, he is harder, drier, and it's just straight up more detailed. Now, Brandon has a lot of good fullness and his back is more developed all around and more pleasing to look at. But detail is just as important as development in my opinion. If we were just taking the upper body on this pose and comparing it, I would probably still make it 2 points for Brandon. I think Hadi does enough to not have this be a perfect score for Brandon, just on the back, but Brandon still racks up enough in the back and in the arms and delts. But then you include the lower body and I just can't do that 2-point victory anymore. Who is more complete top to bottom? Hadi. Who is more balanced top to bottom? Hadi. Who is the better condition and thinner skin in the back? Hadi. I'm no fan of Hadi in this pose, it's pretty weak, but the lower body of Brandon's has to be punished. He still wins the pose, but it's just going to be by 1 point. In the rear lat spread, I think Brandon should be stronger in this pose, at least on paper. He has all that fullness, but not a lot of crisp detail. So that should lend itself to this pose more because it's not just about detail. But when he spreads those lats, it makes his lower body look even weaker than before. Not only that, but Hadi is much better here than in the rear double. He's wider than Brandon, and honestly, it's kind of the end of the story there. We already know Hadi wins the lower body, so now he has the 2 biggest wins he can have in this pose. Brandon is pretty wide himself though, and he is very full and thick in the back from lats to traps. But Hadi has a very clearly defined back, including spinal erectors and traps to counteract that. Brandon has a strong back to keep him in this, but Hadi is still taking the pose. I'll just make it 1 point though to match what Brandon got in his back pose, since I'm sure I'll be getting a lot of pushback on that one. We're finishing up on the side poses now, and these guys are very similar. They're not bringing massively thick poses like Nick Walker or even someone like Dorian Yates. They're more of the streamlined variety. With that said, Hadi does bring something extra to the table. Absolutely killer detail and a phenomenal midsection. He has more detail in the side leg, the midsection of course, the pecs, and he's more defined in the tricep. I think they're both very solid and pretty equal, but with that extra polish, Hadi adds a little cherry on top of his pose. Now I know it's a pretty small difference in the grand scheme of things, but it makes all of the difference. Since these guys are so close and Brandon is lacking something Hadi has, that one thing becomes a large thing when it's the only difference. Brandon is solid, but when Hadi has such a clear detail advantage, that pretty much makes him the default winner of the pose. They're very close, with that little difference in conditioning and the tricep for Hadi makes this pretty even playing field turn into a pretty solid win, so 2 points to Hadi. Hadi's really trying to push for a comeback now, and luckily for him, we have a massive 3-point win for him here. Now, Brandon is not bad in the abs and thighs. I actually had this as just a 2-point win in my rough draft of this, but upon looking again, Brandon is just getting so outclassed here, I can't do it. At first, I thought, well, Brandon does at least have a decent waistline, and I suppose his abs are decent, but as I kept looking at the pose, that sentiment faded, and I realized how poor this looks next to Hadi. Hadi may not have the smaller waist, but his waist is certainly small enough. enough, especially considering how much he utterly decimates Brandon in terms of development and conditioning here in the midsection. Brandon looks weeks out next to Hadi, and that is just the midsection. What convinced me to make this a full 3-pointer was Hadi's legs. Separation may have been a saving grace for Brandon because we know he just doesn't have the size, but there isn't enough. So on top of Brandon's quads not beating Hadi's in detail, he's getting smoked in size as well. So not only did I manage to pretty easily talk myself out of making this a 2-pointer, but I doubt any of you are even considering giving this to Brandon. And the more I looked, the less I saw any silver lining. And finally, we've reached the end of the comparison with the most muscular. Now, this is a great pose for each guy, but Brandon wins for what you could say are the more correct reasons. Hadi wins the legs, but not by as much as he has in previous poses. Brandon looks more solid here with his hand on hip pose than he has throughout this entire comparison. Hadi also takes a win in the midsection, but again, Brandon is holding it together here, literally with a very trim and pleasing waistline. Then Brandon takes over from here. Hadi is pretty good in the chest, but Brandon is thicker and brings enough detail in the hand on hip, and he looks even better in the crab. And then Brandon sweeps wrist to neck by winning the arms, delts, traps, and both incarnations of his pose. Hadi's delt and arm tie-in region once again looks sus, and he definitely doesn't have the best insertions. With his short biceps and lacking forearms, it makes him look pretty skinny in the arms overall next to Brandon's guns. So at the end of it all, Hadi has a slight width advantage to the shoulders and a heck of a lot of detail. But that advantage kind of falters against Brandon's crab, where he manages to really wring out some more detail himself. Hadi does win some key areas like the midsection and legs, but I think if you just compared Brandon's crab to Hadi's pose, it would be barely just a 2-point win for Brandon, maybe just outside of that. And I still think Brandon wins with the hand on hip pose, but less resoundingly. So I think the average between his 2 wins is on the cusp of 2 points. I'm going to just say a strong 1-pointer though to be safe. We're moving on to the overall physique categories next, where we take a look at the whole physique on 4 different metrics. Let's start with the flaws category. I know Brandon is going to get flack for his legs, but that's going to slot into a different category. Outside of that, Brandon really doesn't have any issues, none that I noticed. However, Hadi does have something outside the norm, the delts. It wasn't major, but it was a flaw at this show, and I notice it every time I see this version. So Brandon wins the flaws category with 1 point. Then in muscularity, this is where I will punish Brandon for the quads. Really, they weren't too bad from the front this go around, and from the side you couldn't even tell that they were weak, but from the back they were pretty poor. And even from the front, while they may not have been awful, his upper half is so dominant that the balance is still thrown off. But was he bigger than Hadi? I would say in most areas outside the legs, yes. The chest, the arms, the back, Brandon was slightly bigger in most of these areas, and with that 3D fullness he looked even bigger. However, I'm just going to average this out to a tie. I would give Brandon a slight win if not for the gap in the legs, but I'm not fully comfortable swinging this pendulum all the way into Hadi's column. I feel that they're about even when you consider everything from completeness to the development of the different body parts to pound for pound muscularity. Moving on to shape, this was almost another tie as well. I think Hadi's shape was quite good at this event, but I think I'm in the minority of those that truly love it. With Brandon's smaller waist and even more exaggerated proportions, he's going to get a slight win, but only slight. Again, I really like Hadi. His front double is crazy with that waistline, and part of shape is balance. And Brandon obviously isn't stellar in terms of upper lower body harmony. That leaves conditioning, and I was really torn on this one, but I think I have to go ahead and make it a full 3-pointer. This is Hadi Choopan we're talking about, and Brandon Curry. Hadi was peeled, and you can really see that here in the video. He is tiers above Brandon in muscle maturity, dryness, and detail pretty much everywhere. Was Brandon decent at this 2019 Arnold? Yes, absolutely. This was his best shape ever. But that still is really only what I'd categorize as decent conditioning. He still had that thicker skin type of look, and if you go back and look at the 2019 Arnold Classic, he wasn't even the most detailed at the show. William Bonac was honestly more conditioned. Overall, it seems drastic, but when you really step back and examine what you have, who in their right mind would even give Brandon a hint of being remotely close to Hadi in terms of conditioning? Not me. Alright, now like I said at the beginning of the video, both of these guys have very different perceptions from the public. People were picking their jaws off the floor last year when they saw Hadi. And as I said earlier, I personally believe that this is a top 15 physique of all time, at least top 20. Brandon, on the other hand, is clowned constantly. I don't even really know why either. Yes, he was a weaker Olympia champion, but I really think his prime versions are pretty good. Hopefully this video does shed some light on Brandon here, because this was actually close. He was able to kind of push Hadi here surprisingly. But at the end of it all, Hadi still claims victory here with 55.9 points to Brandon's 44.1. That's not even a 10-point gap, guys, and I do believe it could be fairly close on a modern stage. To tell you the truth of it, with the way the current judging has been going, I think Brandon may actually get a narrow win in the judges' eyes. However, I would disagree with that. Hadi's conditioning and overall quality was overwhelming, especially when you see it in video when they're both going through the poses. Not only that, but Hadi didn't have a gap like Brandon had a gap in the legs. That makes Hadi more complete, or at least more well-rounded, and of course his shape was very good. Brandon is very appealing though, and he does win his fair share of poses. He's going to win one or both of the front shots for a good amount of fans. He's going to win the side chest for most fans, at least one back pose, and maybe the most muscular too. This is why I said the judges would probably give it to him over Hadi. They did at the 2019 Olympia, in fact, which I disagreed with heavily, and still do by the way, and it's kind of like a redux of Samson and Hadi at the 2024 Olympia, since Samson and Brandon are a lot alike. And it turns out Samson, with just enough conditioning, was able to beat Hadi. Again though, I disagree with that as well. But it just seems that when you give the judges a guy with pleasing muscle bellies and a small waist, they just lose their minds. And I think they have a good point, especially with this Brandon. Prime Brandon did have flaws, like a slightly thicker skin leading to the conditioning not being the best, and of course the legs. But that upper body is almost unbeatable for most, including Hadi. Hadi only won because he was able to hang in the upper body, including shape in that too, but then he added much better legs, and his entire physique was miles ahead of Brandon's in terms of conditioning. I do understand why someone might choose Brandon, but not me. He was not the most well-rounded bodybuilder on stage today, and he got outclassed heavily. Brandon's 2019 Arnold Classic package is one of the most underrated physiques of all time, but Hadi's 2024 Arnold Classic package is truly one of the best physiques of all time. Well, that's going to do it for today's video. What do you guys think of this one? Would you say Hadi wins easily, or did he really get pushed here? And a bonus question with a follow-up, just how good is the 2019 Arnold Brandon in the history of bodybuilding, and why is Brandon so hated? Leave me your thoughts down in the comments. And if you guys like these types of videos, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more. And if you want to support the channel even further and get your hands on some high-quality supplements, be sure to head over to Arms Race Nutrition. Then at checkout, use my code PROJECT10 for 10% off your entire order. That's code PROJECT10 at armsracenutrition.com. And finally, with all that said, I want to thank you guys for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.
Gotta get that Lexia.